Please, once again, a round of applause for Richard. I was expecting several answers, but I know, like many of you, he's raised a lot of questions, and some of the points that he was speaking on are points that I hope we're going to get some clarity on as Dapo joins him on stage now. We need to continue to look at journalism and the challenge of it.
We are at a point where we cannot conceive of any future in journalism without underscoring the very important place of technology.
Yes, that's without question. The mentor that he mentioned told me, and this was in 1975, he was the head of public broadcasting in the United States, and we had recently put up the first satellite network in the United States. And he said to me, Richard, he says, if you're interested in the future of media, keep a focus on the technology, because it's what sets the playing field and the ground rules upon which the game was played. Now, that wasn't obvious in 1975, but I think it's much more obvious today. One thing I want to note, yes, I asked a lot of questions. I don't mean to suggest pessimism. I am optimistic, but my optimism starts with recognizing the hard questions we have to ask ourselves, including the hard questions we have to ask about our own practice of journalism. How are we succeeding? How are we not? Do our audiences understand what we do? Do they understand what journalism is? Do they understand the nature of the news outlet you operate? Do they understand the value that you provide? What is that value? I think it starts there. It starts with asking those questions of ourselves. Does our audience understand us? Excuse me, and consequently, how do we serve them better?
I think I'm interested, and I'm sure many people in the crowd here will also be interested in your take on policy. The internet, and plus it, the web, has obviously reshaped the landscape for news and indeed for most things. Governments, as it happened here in 2021, if many people will recall, had to ban Twitter for a while, about a year. So there's a big challenge in how to think of, one, toxic content at one point, and how you want to also, governments probably have some good points at a point. Say, we want to save the community from this toxic content, fake news, hate speech and all that. Do I think that you are a little bit open-ended in your own proposal about how to regulate? Because indeed, regulation is a challenge here. How do we proceed?
Yeah. No, it is a challenge. And when I ask those questions, I don't mean to suggest that there isn't a need for regulation. The question is it smart regulation? Now, those of us who've worked in the press throughout our careers recognize that outside of codifying press freedom in and of itself, the press has always been quite leery of the government being involved, of the government setting regulations, because that too often gets into the details of what do we think you should cover and not cover, so on and so forth. So that's why I pose these questions. Maria Ressa, who won a Nobel Peace Prize, is a close friend of mine. I've been working with her for well over a decade. She obviously has been abused by her government, by the Duterte government. She now also says we need to regulate misinformation. And Maria and I have conversations on a regular basis about that very point, because what I say to her is, let's be very careful what we ask for. Because are we creating mechanisms that can be used against you? Here you are someone who was destroyed by your government, nearly destroyed by your government, and you're asking governments to solve the problem. So, tricky question. And so, for instance, what I say about the whole notion of remuneration by platforms, I'm not suggesting that's inappropriate, but what I do say is you don't want a private company like Google deciding who gets money and who does not, right? If a country wants to pass a law extracting money from digital players, wants to put it into a fund, wants to set up some manner of independent governance for that fund, wants to set appropriate criteria as to what they're trying to achieve. Is it about supporting sustainable journalism? Is it about supporting innovation? Is it about fueling the development of emerging voices? We need new voices. That's why I'm here. That's why I have such regard for DAPO, is because where we're seeing the innovation is almost entirely from the emerging voices. So in crafting these approaches, whether it be misinformation, whether it be publisher remuneration, whether it be copyright, there are good and bad ways to do it. And it's always a challenge when you get into the regulatory process. I don't mean to go on, but one of the things I've often said, and sometimes this is hard for Google to understand, I work in a culture of engineers. I work in a culture of people who are logicians. They think every problem has a logical solution. Have you ever worked in politics and public policy? Logic seldom gets invited into the room, right? So let's just be careful of the conversations we have. Let's be careful what we ask for to make sure we get the result we actually deserve.
And I agree with you. I mean, I love the little anecdote about, the logic and the logic of politics. But let me play the devil's advocate here on behalf of governments. And they will agree, okay, it's fine. You guys go ahead and regulate the print sector. But we have a situation in broadcasting that is really crazy, and then they throw Rwanda at you. See the kind of mayhem that happened in Rwanda, which still, they use that as a basis of saying, well, government must still try to regulate. We have it, that we hear that kind of arguments here too. And how will you weigh in on that?
Well, you get into several issues there. One is, I think in every society, are we doing our utmost to make sure that there are authoritative sources of news available and in existence? And are we stimulating their creation? Can we overwhelm bad information with good information? Are we doing the right thing with fact-checking as best we can to help people understand the difference between these things? And in regulating misinformation, and again, what is one trying to regulate? There's always the interesting question of hate speech. How does one define hate speech? It's a valid concept. In the United States, hate speech is a very high bar. You pretty much have to be saying, meet me at this location, bring your guns, we're going to attack someone, right? But unfortunately, often, as we know, as we see in our politics, driving outrage, driving hate can be done with extraordinary nuance. So it's a particularly challenging problem to address. But here too, I think it's ultimately on all of us in the institutions that we lead, be they news institutions, civil societies, be they governments, be they platforms, do our best to uphold principles, right? We try to be very clear about our principles with Google search. We try to be very clear about how our methodologies operate search. We try to do our best to enable third-party researchers to say, this is what you're doing right, this is what you're doing wrong, right? Is that a suitable approach, for instance, to the concept of algorithmic accountability? Again, I'm not suggesting there aren't thoughtful approaches. I think there can be, but we need to kind of go through those levels of understanding in detail to get there.
I want to the arguments that you made regarding regulation of sorts. Seeing what the battle has been in Australia, in Canada, and I think increasingly now in California, where you come from, and you've proposed something actually very revolutionary here today. Would you be comfortable, say, if, and it's hit Africa disproportionately, I must tell you, would you be comfortable if, say, a mechanism, a body in Africa engages with institutions like yours to say, listen, we have to rebuild the media, and we have to rebuild it for development's sake, for democracy's sake. This is what has been lost in terms of the erosion of resources to tech. Are we at that point, or is this just Richard who's have a more liberal attitude? Do you think your industry is open to that kind of conversation?
I can't speak for the industry. I can speak for ourselves. And I wouldn't say that today if we didn't mean it. The challenge that we had in Australia, the challenge we're having in Canada, is because those approaches are not what I said, right? The approach in Australia was driven by some particular big global media companies to benefit particularly those big media companies, right? In Canada, it's hard to see with the regulation that they've passed that it will actually have the benefit for quality journalism for local communities that they say it would have, right? So we have a problem with that. In Canada, they also imposed, they're the first country in the world to have crafted a law that imposes a link tax that says that Google search has to pay for the links we include to news organizations in search. And I say, wait a second, that is self-harming, right? I look at Google search as the largest newsstand on earth that publishers don't have to pay to be on, right? It's our job to try to connect people with sources of authoritative information. Why would you create a disincentive for us doing that as extensively as possible, right? It did not have to happen that way. So obviously we object in Canada. And depending on how that plays out, that's going to cause us to take unfortunate product action, but we feel we have no choice because the core principles there of, in a sense, breaking how the internet works and also suggesting, I find this point almost to the point of absurdity to suggest that a significant portion of the financial support of the news industry in Canada should come from a single private company decided by that private company? How is that thoughtful public policy? I don't see it. Again, there are better approaches. We've laid out thoughts. We're trying to be constructive here. But that's what I said, is when you get into the public policy environment, too often it's not necessarily about thoughtfulness and understanding of the ecosystem, but how do I drive a particular result for a particular self-interest?
So let's think a little bit about the points you made about the audience. And I find also very fascinating your speech. How would we win back the audience? Because you really give a very grim statistics, If 80% or 10%, Reuters is saying only 10%, and Google search is saying 2%. That people we're not talking to. So we really have to find a new way of reaching our audience. What are your thoughts?
I think it's a process. I think it first starts, as I was noting earlier, do we understand how the audience looks at us as journalists? Versus thinking we understand how they look at us as journalists. Do the research. I said that to a friend of mine who at the time was managing editor of the Los Angeles Times, and she said, Richard, I know my audience. I know my audience. And I said, but wait a second. Don't you tell your reporters to ask a whole lot of questions before you reach a conclusion? Then maybe you want to ask your audience a whole lot of questions before you reach that conclusion. What are they interested in? What do they value? I think that important point that I tried to make about how do we go beyond accountability journalism, that obviously is core, it's foundational. But there are so many other areas of content that are of value to our communities that can help build those bridges, right? The terminology, the linguistics, I think are critical. And I think that's something that has not been studied enough. Politicians, as you know, study linguistics. They study it to death. They know the exact phrase that's going to trigger support, trigger fear. Are we doing that same analysis about the language we use? In fact, do we not often parrot the phrases of politicians that actually hide the actual thrust of what they're proposing to do, right? So I think those three things, research, understanding linguistics, understanding our audience, innovating, trying new approaches. I like to use the term experimentation. It's not about success or failure, but can you experiment? I headed a publishing company called Salon, great writers, but always long articles. And I said to them, you know, only 25% of anyone who clicks on the article finishes it. What does that tell us about our objective to get knowledge into people's heads? I said, experiment, try things. That was hard because there are some journalists, I mean, we're all the same, right? As human beings, we don't like to change. Don't move the cheese, as they say. You know, and I remember there was a writer working for us, a great writer, but I swear to God, he could not burp in less than 1,500 words because his entire self-esteem was based on the fact that he was allowed to write 1,500 words. So how do we experiment with the form to achieve the result we're looking to achieve?
Let's talk a little bit about this topic that you've touched on, the synthetic media, as it were, AI, and what it means in our lives. The reality in our own market here is the disruption is going to be far greater. But there's here a hint of hope in your own presentation. Can you help walk us a little further to get some sense of what the points of hope are?
Yes, and again, we just have to acknowledge the technology is there. The technology is going to be used by the bad guys, not necessarily I mean, we'll try to make sure our technology isn't used by the bad guys, but there's going to be a lot of technology out there. But I do look at the positive side. And in fact, I think it's really important. Right now, the journalism community, my sense is, thinks of AI with fear. They think of AI as being about efficiencies that lose jobs. And I go like, oh, but wait a second, let's go beyond that. Let's go beyond that. Yes, there are efficiencies. But can we also look at it to expand what we do? And remember my earlier point, can we reach out and address the broad needs of a community? Right? Look at any community, whatever community you live in, what percentage of the people in your community are interested in what goes on in local sports more than what they're interested in goes on in local government? Right? So how do we make sure to provide that coverage? You don't have the reporting staff. Can you write those narrative stories? Can you draft those narrative stories off of sports statistics? Yes, you can, to broaden that coverage, to gauge more reach in your community, to drive advertising revenue in local communities, right? The advertising model is not dead. It's how we connect it between the right audiences and the right people with the right techniques. And so I do think AI is incredibly useful for that. For years, we've been providing tools called Pinpoint that are also AI generated. They don't generate text, but they analyze a large corpora of documents for investigative journalists, feed it 10,000 documents and have it go through and find all the named entities and the dates and the connections between things. That's powerful, right? How do we give journalists the capabilities to have the superpowers we need journalists to have? So let's embrace that. But that's really on each organization. And we'll do our best to provide the capabilities, the APIs, work with companies who can create the tools that you can use if your company can't take and enable them yourselves.
So, I mean, our time, and I'll just ask one last question, which connects with how the project of journalism, democracy building, and just spreading freedom and liberty across the world. And I know earlier today we spoke about what's happening in Ukraine. And Google had played some little role. So in troubled spots of the world, using the Ukraine model, what can Google do in Africa, for instance?
Yeah, look, I think we're extraordinarily good at technology. Right. We're not journalists. Some of us have journalism in our backgrounds. I use the word collaboration a lot because without collaboration, we don't necessarily know what to do. Right? We didn't know exactly what tools to create for investigative journalists. We only did after we spent a whole lot of time talking to journalists and said, what should we build? Some things we know a lot about is security. How do we keep a website up and operating, for instance, and that's what we did in Ukraine. And we still work with exiled Russian publications who are finding a new home on the internet every day. And how can we help with that as well? So we'll try to do our part at every dimension. And you might ask why. Why does Google bother? I think that's a fair question. Let me tell you why we bother, and let me tell you why I've been working there for 15 years. Google, I think uniquely, because of Google search, we are in the middle of this ecosystem of expression, right? Google search would have no value if there wasn't a rich corpus of expression out there on this thing called the internet, right? Our money, we make all of our money has come from advertising, and 2/3 of the advertisers are small businesses who can now take advantage of advertising that they could not in the days of print because it was inefficient, right? So we have not only an interest in the principle of open societies, our business is best in open societies, and we recognize that the measure of an open society is the measure of press freedom within that society. So we understand the importance of us doing our part, right? And we'll continue to do that as best we can. And I'll continue to do that because I feel that's important and because the work of people like you inspires me to do that.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's such an engaging discussion with you. Thank you, listeners. And I guess.
As I sometimes say, I've always been an optimistic person. The glass is always half full. Sometimes these days, the glass is better if it's half full of gin.
In these 2 seconds, can you pronounce your last name for us? That's become something of a big debate at the back.
Okay, so in English-speaking countries, it's best pronounced Gingras. However, I had to testify in Canada recently. They said, Richard, come to Canada, you must testify. And when they introduced me, because Canada is French and English, and I am of Canadian heritage, they introduced me as Richard Gingras. And people at Google said, Richard, they mangled your name. And I said, actually, no, they got my name right. So Gingras is the correct French pronunciation. Gingras, I'll gladly accept.
All right, thank you so much for that, Richard. So we're going to questions from the audience now. The ushers are in the aisles. Please remember, straight, simple, and short.
I mentioned earlier the work of the Constructive Journalism Institute in Denmark. They've been around a while. They work around the world. An interesting fellow by the name of Ulrich Hagerup. Constructive journalism, it's not happy news. The approach, though, the thoughtful approach, to me it starts with the notion of, sometimes journalists get uncomfortable with the word advocacy. I shouldn't be an advocate. Well, one way to look at it is say, well, you are indeed advocates for the interests of your community. And so when you're covering a story, if you take the philosophy of constructive journalism, if there, for instance, is a bus crash at a certain intersection in the city, and you're reporting on that, and 12 people died, well, that's not exactly a happy story, but you're going to report it. But can you report it with an air of constructiveness of saying, yes, this happened. Here are the reasons why we think it happened. Here are what some of the potential solutions might be, right? So can you begin to break it apart? Can we kind of go beyond, the old phrase about news is it bleeds, it leads, right? So can we make sure that in covering the story, it's not just about the bus crash that day, that in subsequent days you're going back to it and saying, well, how do we address this constructively, right? How do we address the constructive approaches that can address the needs of our society? Can we do that in evolved approaches to storytelling that help users say, yeah, This is important. I like what these people are doing. They're helping my community be a better place. They're not just beating me over the head with all of the bad things that do happen in my community, right? I mean, there's an innate friction in journalism, in that journalism, by its definition, news, by its definition, covers the anomalistic. It covers the things that don't happen often. And often those are things that are ugly and awful and terrible, right? So can we kind of get around that? Can we move beyond that such that we're not simply reinforcing the bad things? Another element, let me get to one other point, because there was another project that I've tried to do based on data, which is this, which is, are you giving the community the appropriate context for what happened, right? There was a shooting. Was that an anomalistic event, or was that an infrequent event? And are you giving your community an understanding of the difference? If this is the first time this has happened in 2 years, that's significant. If it's happening every day, that's a different story. But too often, it's too easy to talk about the horror and end up emphasizing the fear that people have. So to me, that's too another way of, can we give context, right? I didn't talk about this today, but we live in a world, in a landscape of distorted risk, right? Like in my country, the odds are much greater that I'll die of cancer than a car crash or a shooting, but if you did an analysis of the news, it would tell you that I have a much greater likelihood of dying of a shooting than of cancer. Well, kind of that's on us, because we don't give them the context to understand the difference. That, to me, is another element of a constructive approach to journalism. Sorry for the length of the answer.
Richard, because my question is very close to that. So if you can just take the two together, because I listened to your conversation. My question to you is, because you suggested also in that conversation that the relationship between the media and Google should not be transactional. So what is the nature of relationship are you suggesting should happen between the media and the tech companies?
Yeah, I often hear that point, that the advertising that newspapers got went to Google. So I'm going to challenge you as journalists to really investigate that point, because I have never seen any economic analysis that backs that up. And I'll give you a very simple explanation. There's no question the world of media and advertising changed. And the phrase I did often use is that newspapers in 1985 were the internet of their communities. You went to them for everything. And it was a tremendously effective business model. But what happened to the advertising? It's really important to look at it at the very specific ingredients. 30% of a newspaper's advertising 40 years ago was classified ads. Great business. What happened to classified ads? They went to online marketplaces. They didn't come to Google, right? They went to online marketplaces. Craigslist, jobs marketplaces, so on and so forth. Next, department stores. Department stores, at least in North America and Europe, were the second largest category of revenue for a newspaper. What happened to them? They've disappeared in a world of e-commerce. They've disappeared in a world of Amazon. You look at supermarkets, food service companies, coupons, right? My mom always clipped the coupons off out of the newspaper to get the discount. That doesn't even happen anymore, right? In the United States, you enter your phone number, and if you're part of their loyalty program, you get the discounts. Car dealers. So 80% of newspaper advertising basically disappeared into the internet. It didn't come to Google. So, but again, I'm not saying we don't have a role to play going forward, but I think if we're going to talk about support for journalism going forward, we should be accurate in understanding what really happened with the disruption. Like I hear often today, they say, oh, Google and Facebook control 80% of the advertising market. It's not true. Actually, we don't even know that, but if you look, there are third parties all over the place that say now on average, Google's percentage of the ad market is like 28%. It's significant. But also note that part of that revenue is the 30% we make in providing tools that publishers use to drive ad revenue. So it's just a whole lot more nuanced than what one suggests when they say, oh, the newspaper business died because of Google. I mean, again, if that can be proven, then state it. But what I find really unfortunate in these debates about public policy is to have people who are suggesting that the public policy is needed for the future of journalism, but then citing statistics and statements that are profoundly untrue. So, and I will challenge you to prove me wrong on that point. And I've worked with competition commissions across the world and economic analysis across the world, and I have yet to find it. You know, as I pointed out, 2/3 of our advertisers are small businesses who couldn't advertise in newspapers because it wasn't efficient. If I'm a restaurant in one neighborhood of a city, I'm not going to advertise in a newspaper covering the whole city. But in search, if I search for let me find a seafood restaurant in this neighborhood, I'm going to pop an ad. Highly efficient, good for the economy. So again, I'm perfectly willing to defend our position, and I'm perfectly willing to do our utmost to play our role going forward. But I think if there's any area of public policy where we deserve to be accurate about how we assess the situation, it is that.